I'm Joan Kjaer, and this is WorldCanvass. Thank you for being with us tonight for our program focusing on the Middle East. WorldCanvass is presented by International Programs, your global intersection, connecting Iowa with the world in a university without borders. We're gathered in the Senate chamber of the Old Capitol Museum tonight, and this program will be broadcast over UI-TV and KRUI-FM. We are streaming WorldCanvass live over International Programs' website. That is accents.international.uiowa.edu. Live streaming is made possible by our partners in ITS, Information Technology Services. I'd like to introduce our first guests, and they are Denise Filios, Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese, Christopher Merrill, Director of UI International Writing Program, and Vicki Hesli, the Professor of Political Science here at the University of Iowa. Please give them a warm welcome. So Denise, hello. Thank you for being with us tonight. And I know you've recently just come back from North Africa, and you spent many years doing research, traveling to various spots in North Africa, and also you serve as the director of the Middle East and Muslim World Studies program, which is part of international programs at the university. I wonder if you could offer some clarification to us on these terms, the Middle East and the Muslim world.
Yeah, I think the theme that I would most want to emphasize when it comes to the Middle East and the Muslim world is diversity. That Middle East, in fact, is a region of the world that includes some 18 different countries that are linguistically, culturally, geographically diverse. Such countries as Egypt in North Africa, Israel, Gaza in the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, of course Turkey, which is a Turkish country, not Arab, Cyprus in the Mediterranean. Moving east, we can talk about Iraq, Iran, which is Persian, and then of course the 7 countries of the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait. The Muslim world has some 48 countries, again, very geographically, culturally, linguistically diverse, but also religiously diverse. The country that I most work on, Morocco, would be considered a Muslim country. It is a Muslim majority country, and Islam has an official status as is the official religion, but there's still tremendous diversity within the country itself. The city I'm most familiar with, Fez, is actually a city that's got 3 different cities within it. The old city, which is this wonderful Medina, very labyrinthine, easy to get lost. There's a newer city that's actually got a good Jewish center, the Merrill, and then the new city, which is about a 19th, 20th century French colonial city, which is laid out very much like Paris, in fact, with boulevards to go strolling, etc. And so that sort of living spaces which are very different, religious practices which vary from women who wear a full covering to women who don't cover their head at all. There's a big debate as to whether it's necessary for women to cover their head in Islam. Linguistic diversity with Arabic, or Moroccan colloquial Arabic is the prominent language, the dominant language, but modern standard Arabic is spoken, of course, French, English, etc. as well. I also recently was able to visit the Arabian Gulf. I got to visit Oman. I went to Muscat, which is this lovely city, which is very new, under development, all sorts of exciting things happening there. Dubai and Abu Dhabi, similar new developments, cultural developments, new building, and also a wonderfully deep historical sense in the center of these cities. So once again, I would say that, like I said, the topic I'd like to most emphasize is the diversity of this territory. And the problem with the term the Muslim world is it would seem to suggest that everyone who lives in these 48 countries would be Muslim, and it creates a sort of false sense of homogeneity within this vastly diverse territory of the world, and even within these countries, massive diversity.
Well, it's obviously, in terms of the term the Middle East, for example, geographically, for those of us who aren't familiar with the area, we're just thinking in big terms about the world. We can sort of place it on a map. We sort of know generally what we're talking about. What is the principal caution to that? I mean, obviously the diversity is part of it, but But as you say, you're rimming the whole Mediterranean there, and then you're in the Gulf. And Turkey, very different from some of the other countries you mentioned. Saudi Arabia, very different yet. Is it a useful term at all?
I think it is a useful term in part because we do need to be able to think in terms of regions, and there are certain similarities that help make the Middle East sort of make sense to talk about as a unity. In fact, I'm not as concerned with Middle East per se as I am with Muslim world, because I think that especially when just the terminology creates false expectations. It's true the Middle East itself has a sort of tortured history as a term. It was developed really by British colonialists who placed the Middle East in between the West and India, and that was the middle bit that kind of maybe didn't have a lot of identity. And now, of course, the Middle East we tend to associate, unfortunately, with conflicts and with specifically with religious and political conflicts. And so it's often presented as a problem space, which, of course, ignores the fact that there's quite a lot of wonderful cultural contributions and quite wonderful places to live and visit.
Sure. That might be a good transition opportunity for us to go to you, Vicki, and to talk about what ties people in this very large region. If we were to think first about the Middle East, the term the Middle East, what ties people together politically there? What differences are there in the way politics play themselves out within each country and related to one another? Small question.
No, big question, big question. Well, actually, thinking about the idea of ties, I guess one could think in terms of common problems or challenges that are faced within the region. And a couple of things that I might think about are, first of all, a challenge of water scarcity, and then almost opposite kind of a challenge, the challenge of oil abundance. And each of these has its own sort of different politics and economics associated with them. Let me talk a little bit first about this idea of water. Water is well, the Middle East and North Africa is the most water scarce region of the world. A simple figure that the world's only 1.4% of the world's renewable fresh water is found in the Middle East, which gives us a little bit of a sense of the problem. And of course, population growth has exacerbated this problem in recent years. And we can expect that water scarcity could lead to crises associated with water. So we see an increasing risk of conflict associated with water issues. The most evident example, of course, is the Jordan River Basin. That is the area that has the most serious water scarcity issues surrounding it. We could ask interesting questions, for example, to what degree is the water scarcity issue a hidden contributing factor to the Israeli Palestinian conflict? Certainly a good question is the extent of the possibility of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank. Is the possibility of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank constrained by this water scarcity issue? Another one of the sort of major river basin problems or water scarcity problems in the Middle East, of course, is the Nile River Basin, and the second is the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin. With regard to the Nile, Ethiopia diverts water from the Nile. With regard to the Euphrates-Tigris River, it's Turkey that likes to use the water upstream for its own irrigation purposes, not necessarily leaving an adequate supply for mostly Iraq, but also for Syria. So these are significant issues in the area, and the fact that sort of the downstream countries are victims, sort of at the mercy of the upstream countries, and how that's going to get worked out politically is a very interesting and sort of unifying challenge for the region. Switching over quickly to oil, one of the things that is fascinating, of course, is that we have exactly the opposite issue in the sense that, of course, with water, the Middle East is it's the area where there's the greatest degree of scarcity, and with oil, it's the area where it's the greatest degree of abundance. Yeah. So depending on which figures you use and which estimates are employed, approximately 75% of the world's proved reserves of petroleum are found in the Middle East. And again, that number to me is almost as astounding as the water scarcity number. And not only that, but most of this oil is concentrated in the area around the Persian Gulf or around the Arabian Gulf, whichever of the terms you use. And of course, Saudi Arabia is unique in that it has the most oil. Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are estimated at 22% of the world's total. So that means 1/5 of all the world's remaining oil is under the control of Saudi Arabia. Next after Saudi Arabia is Iran, as the second largest reserves. Then comes Iraq with the third largest reserves. And then you have other countries like Kuwait and the UAE that also have disproportionately large reserves of petroleum. One kind of an interesting fact is that Kuwait has more proved oil reserves than does Russia. And we always think of Russia as having, a reasonably large amount of oil. So what are the issues involved with this? So very quickly. First of all is the history of the incursion of Western powers into the region. So you have Europeans, you have Americans, and now the industrialized Asian countries, Japan and China, seeing the oil in the Middle East as being essential to their own security, and access to oil is then part of their national security goals. So the United States being far and away the largest oil consumer in the world, another interesting figure, the United States consumes twice as much oil and imports twice as much oil as the next largest consumer, which is China. So needless to say, that leads to this international sort of continual involvement in the Middle East in a sort of unnatural sense. The second issue is competition within the region that's associated with oil. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, among the reasons for that invasion was the desire by Saddam Hussein to liberate the oil-rich region of Khuzestan province in Iran. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, it was because among the many reasons he invaded Kuwait, one was that he accused Kuwait of stealing shared oil resources and also pumping too much oil and therefore undermining the price of the oil. So again, this sort of internal conflict issue. Related to this are the pipelines that run through the Middle East. So you have certain countries that have the pipelines, for example, Turkey having a significant number of pipelines, so you have the politics of pipelines. And then the very last point, I'll just finish this up very, very quickly, has to do with the impact on the countries themselves versus sort of international relations, the countries themselves associated with oil. And here's the argument that oil maintains dictatorships. Again, the argument being that they don't have to tax, therefore they're not accountable. These governments don't have to tax for the revenues, therefore they're not accountable. And also the argument, which is pretty well supported now in the literature, that oil also undermines economic development because of the lack of the spillover effects into other sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing sectors. So those are sort of shared problems of the region.
Yeah, well, one of the things I know that we'll come back and talk about later is this, I think, perception in many parts of the world that the Middle East is one thing. It is one scary thing, filled with people who don't like some other people in other parts of the world or whatever, that this is a place where I think I'm hoping one of the myths we can dispel in this program tonight for anybody who happens to listen is that the Middle East is just kind of one thing with people with one kind of mindset, in the same way that America is not filled with people with just one kind of mindset. But I think that we do have to address the pent-up dissatisfaction some of the Middle East have with what some of the rest of the countries in the world are seen to be doing to their own to the politics they face at home, issues related to terrorism and how we can approach some of those things as partners toward world peace and so on. And Chris, I'll just turn to you. We can, that'll run through the whole course of the evening. What can we do to make our world a safer place and help introduce, understanding everywhere? I don't expect you to answer it, but you've got a pretty good travel history in the Middle East and elsewhere. You've just come back, I know, recently from a trip to Iran, where not very many Americans are going outside of the government these days. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about your perception, and perhaps Vicki and Denise can join in as well. As a scholar with lots of experience around the world, what stands out to you in your Middle Eastern experience that might be different from other places you may have visited?
Well, short of solving all the problems in the Middle East, a few things come to mind. When Vicki talked about the Jordan River, I'm remembering the first time I crossed it at the Allenby Bridge between Jordan and Israel. The Jordan River is about 6 feet wide. And, you remember from reading the Bible, you imagine, it's, this huge river where all these things happen, and then you just see this little trickle of water, which is remarkable. And the other thing I'm thinking about is when I was in Iran in the fall, I spent a week in Shiraz and Esfahan and Tehran. I was a guest of the University of Tehran. We were looking to see what kinds of academic exchanges we might be able to create between the University of Iowa and the University of Tehran. And so they had a guest house there. It was interesting to me that I was there, and there was a German language scholar from Cologne who came every 6 months or so to teach for a few weeks. And then there were 6 Chinese academics. And they had just been over to King Abdullah's, the opening ceremony of King Abdullah's huge university in Saudi Arabia, where they've invested billions of dollars to create a state-of-the-art scientific university where men and women, for the first time in the kingdom, are in classes together. The Chinese scholars had been there for that opening. Now they were in Tehran, and what I remember, we had dinner together one night, and the guest master went out and got us all Iranian food, and the Chinese scholars brought out all of their Chinese condiments to put on top of the Iranian food, and including dried vegetables. I thought this was very funny, but what I was noticing was the Chinese are developing the natural gas fields in Iran extensensively, and they are trying to create academic ties in the same way that we were trying to do in a small-scale way. But bear in mind that they hold one of the vetoes, possible vetoes, at the UN Security Council over sanctions being imposed on Iran. Well, they're likely not to go along with that sanctions regime because they are in the business of doing business with Iran, as Russia is in the business of doing business with Iran, even as the United States and France and Germany and England are trying to figure out how to contain the development of nuclear weapons. That'll give you some sense of the complications there. The last thing I just wanted to leave you an image of is Denise and I have traveled a lot in Morocco, and I think one of the interesting things is that Morocco has no oil. So they've had to develop a rather more open kind of society. You see many different Islams competing there. I was there for the Sufi festival, which was quite fascinating to see musicians appealing to all segments of society, a concert filled with old and young, middle class, upper class, lower class people, a vibrant tourist industry. All of that was going on, and then I went from there to the West Bank. I wanted to attend the Samaritan Passover ceremony, and I wanted to go there because the Samaritans are the smallest religious ethnic group left on earth. There are exactly 742 Samaritans left in 2 villages, one on the West Bank, one on a village south of Tel Aviv. And they're so small that they've had to start importing Russian and Ukrainian brides to replenish the gene pool. And I wanted to go because the elderly Kahan, the priest or rabbi, said to me one day that the Samaritans could build a bridge of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians because they're the only people who are respected on both sides. And in fact, they actually have Israeli and Palestinian passports. So I went to this event, which is up on Mount Gerizim. It's on the second tallest mountain on the West Bank. And there were about 5,000 people there. What was interesting, they slaughtered 48 lambs all in one fell slash. And then they cooked them in these big pits for hours. There were about 5,000 people there, Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, Jewish settlers with their M16s slung over their shoulders. And a woman said to me there had never been a violent incident at this ceremony every fall, every spring at this Passover. So I wanted to see what that was all about. And in fact, there was no violence that night, although I did see some Palestinians led away in handcuffs. They didn't have the proper ID. And in order to get to this village, they had to have somebody from within the village leave their ID with the Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint outside. So that was a bit complicated. But there was indeed no violence, and I was trying to think as I was leaving whether I saw any hope for peace here. And what I saw was the street was filled with so much smoke from the fires and the lambs being cooked that I couldn't see anything. I'll leave you with that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk just a little bit about the Palestinian-Israeli issue and how does that play out through the whole region we might think of as the Middle East or the Muslim world for that matter. How central is a settlement of some of the major disputes between Palestinians and the Israeli government right now? How central is that to movement forward as a region, do you think?
I think it's very central. I mean, one of the things that I found very interesting, I had a Fulbright to Tunisia in spring of 2000, and almost every time I got into a taxi, after a little while of chatting with the driver, one of the things that they would always ask about is U.S. support for Israel. And this is in Tunisia, right? That clearly there was a real identification on the part of many Tunisians with Palestinians, and certainly the same is true on the part of many Moroccans, that there's a very strong identification. I also happened to be in Tunisia in 2002 when there was incursions on I think it was the West Bank, and watching those while I was at a conference, and again, a very strong emotional reaction to these images on satellite TV. Everyone has satellite TV, everyone is able to see these images, and I do think it's key, really, and that there be a solution that is not imposed and unilaterally, that it be a solution that is very much negotiated and very much arrived at through discussions and through.
I guess I really do feel that it's. I don't think there's anything more crucial, not only to peace in the Middle East, but arguably to peace in the world. I think that's how central it is. Every single one of the alignments politically is associated with position vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict. Many of the decisions that are made about sort of, it's almost hard to describe how strongly it influences. And arguably there are a number of proxy wars are of course being fought rather than a direct confrontation. So it's an ongoing conflict between forces supplied and represented by organizations like Hezbollah and Israeli forces, but that's just one example. I mean, the conflict permeates the region, and the fact that Egypt, which was an original founder of all of the sort of major organizations in the region, Arab Islamic organizations in the region, being completely ostracized and literally removed from those organizations, expelled from those organizations because it had the audacity to consider a separate peace, with Israel, is again, to me, an indication. But I mean, there's so many more examples that we could give. Sure. Many examples.
Well, coming back to the cultural side, Chris, I'd like to ask you two questions. One is, how does our State Department respond to your initiatives with the International Writing Program to bring writers, obviously from all over the world, but were there special political tensions that State Department is really sensitive about? Has that affected your ability to bring in writers? Yeah,
well, I can say that one thing is we pride ourselves on having in residence every fall writers, both Palestinian and Israeli writers, which always makes for an interesting conversation. Inevitably, they become friends. They share much more than divides them. Inevitably, they disagree about the possible solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but their conversations always inform the rest of the writers and help to break down some of the stereotypes that many writers bring to the table. No matter how sophisticated their thinking might be, they come with rather knee-jerk ideas about, particularly about the Israeli writers. So that's one of the things we do. But since 9/11, there's been much more encouragement for us to find ways to engage with writers in the Middle East. So we've brought writers, American writers, to Oman and Saudi Arabia, to Cyprus, to Turkey, to Tunisia and Morocco, to Syria and Jordan and the West Bank, to teach creative writing workshops, to engage with students, to give readings, to meet with editors and political figures and cultural activists. And those exchanges, I think, have been quite revelatory both for the American delegations that we have put together and for their interlocutors on the other side, because when people have face-to-face contact, they come away with more nuanced ways of thinking about those they regard as other or as the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other question I wanted to ask you was about your most recent trip, but start the conversation about the film, the Sukukaz, Writing Within and Beyond the City Walls. A wonderful film is now available for anybody to see who's interested on your website about your 2009 symposium or gathering in Morocco. It's amazing. Could you just talk for a second about these?
Well, that came out of, a State Department-funded program where we brought together 15 or 16 writers from around the world to Fez, which has this marvelous Medina, and the life in this Medina, it's an ancient life. You can walk into the tanneries and watch them slaughter the sheep and shear the fleece off and drop it into the limestone and see the men in the vegetable dye. It's not a job I think most of us would want to have, but there's that life. And so we brought these writers together to discuss what this city is, and out of those discussions came this film that was put together. I should tell you, the way that film got put together, the filmmaker Stephen Schneider, we found him the year before. We were in Cyprus on our way to the Cycladic island of Paros for a symposium on the nature of home. Our filmmaker for that got stuck in Beirut when Hezbollah had one of its little actions. Hezbollah, which is funded largely by Iran, takes its marching orders from Tehran, took over half the country, was really kind of a civil war. So our filmmaker then got stuck in Beirut. He couldn't get out. On just a few hours' notice, we lined up Stephen, who was living in Nicosia. He came with us, shot all this footage. So then we thought, oh my God, he's really terrific, and we brought him to Fez to make the film for us, which really captures that interchange, both among the writers and this dynamic and mysterious city.
Well, there's one moment, not too far into the film, where an architect is interviewed, and he shows the intricate pieces that are being laid together as they begin to plan a facade, I think, for a building. And he explains that by design, there's no definite line between one structure and another. They're intended to run together. It's just a beautiful moment with this architect that, I didn't expect to find in this film. So,
well, and it's also, it points
it.
to that what he's talking about is in Fez, you can see the outside of a building. It's absolutely nondescript. You're walking down these narrow alleys and you see a door and you have no idea what might be behind that door. But if you can walk through that door, you will walk into this incredible courtyard with gardens and a whole nother life and water fountains. And where we had our sessions, there was always a turtle walking around. And one writer fell into a pool at a certain point, and it's a magical life inside.
Well, thank you so much. You just heard Christopher Merrill, Vicki Hesli, and Denise Filios. Thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
This is WorldCanvass from International Programs, your global intersection at the University of Iowa, connecting students, faculty, and Iowans with one another and the world. I'm Joan, Kjaer, and I hope you'll check out our International Programs website. You find all sorts of interesting information about people and projects, original articles and commentary, and links to events with an international focus. And that website is accents.international.uiowa.edu. Thank you all for coming here tonight. I hope you'll enjoy our very interesting panel of guests, and I'm very honored to have our next guest with us now, Bill Aossey from Cedar Rapids. Please give him a warm welcome. Well, I'll ask Bill to tell you in his own words who he is and what he does, but very shortly, he is from Cedar Rapids and has made a wonderful international business, MIDAMAR. I will ask you to describe what you do, but Mid-American Agricultural Research is what MIDAMAR stands for. Bill is the founder and the president of that company, and so welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. And I think many of you recognize that greeting. It's not strictly an Islamic greeting. How many of you have been to anywhere in North Africa, Middle East, or Southeast Asia? Can somebody tell me just real quickly some of the countries you've been to? Morocco? Lebanon, Jordan, Syria? Where else? Kazakhstan? Any? This gives you an idea, and the reason I say Assalamu alaikum, because we being from the Midwest, this is really a historic greeting, because as the American Indians always say, may you come in peace and may you go in peace. And Assalam means may peace be with you. And the reason I say that Assalamu alaikum is the most known greeting in the world today, more than good morning, good morgen, bonjour, from Seattle to Senegal to Saudi Arabia to Sudan to Shanghai. The greeting of the Assalamu alaikum is recognized by more than 3 billion people in the world today. And as I said, it's not strictly an Islamic greeting, because within the Middle East, Armenians, Christians will say Assalamu alaikum. So with that, I say within Iowa, my grandfather came in 1888 and settled in northwest Iowa. My father came in 1907. How many of you before September 11th had really thought much about Islam or met any Muslims? Can I see a show of hands? And this is one of the dilemmas that we have today, because Islam has been misperceived within the media. And I say that it is, regardless how the media has projected Islam, Islam is not going to change, and we as Muslims know who we are, and we know what Islam is. But the detriment, in my opinion, is what it has done to the American psyche. Now, you were talking in the previous about global terrorism. I just came back Monday from Nigeria. We were with a U.S. Department of Agriculture delegation for the Rice Council, wheat, soybeans, lentils, and beans on a program to see how to take U.S. agricultural proteins to Nigeria for school feeding and to enhance protein development. We transited through Holland, and this is supposedly where the young man from Nigeria transited in December. Nowhere in the world do I travel from Indonesia to Malaysia to Africa to Europe do we have the type of security that we have in the U.S. airports. Then when we talk about global terrorism, and I will come back to our Iowa experience, but since some of these were covered within the previous, what is bothersome sometimes when we hear Secretary of State Hillary Clinton or various speeches in UN saying the entire world is with us on this resolution, it is not correct, because you can say most of Latin America, South America, virtually all of the African states and countries do not align with this policy vis-a-vis Iran. And we have this perception that the entire world consists of about 10 countries, Japan and China, half a dozen European countries, the United States and Canada. So when we have this perception that the entire world is with us, it's generally narrowed down to less than 15 countries. So we have to change our perception of the world. I was sitting here looking at if this gathering represented the world population, this block within the center here would be the population representation. If we had a map up here and you start in Korea and Japan and throughout China and down to Afghanistan and Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and Indonesia, if we took that circle, that is almost 70% of the world's population. And that would be this group right here. You and I would represent United States, Canada, and Mexico. The two over there would represent the European Union. And over here, you would have South America and the rest of and 1 billion people in Africa. So we are in a changing world order. The United States, with about 5% of the world's population today, we are in a changing global environment. That brings me back to our experience as Muslims in Iowa. Last November, we were invited up to El-Khoury. How many of you are familiar with the history of El-Khoury, Iowa? Mm-hmm. There's our good friend in the back there. El-Khoury, Iowa is a small town north of here, and it comes from the name Abdul Qadir al-Jaziri. Abdul Qadir was a freedom fighter from North Africa, and one of the historians that loved his history equated Abdul Qadir to George Washington. So there's a city here in Iowa named El-Khoury. It has a sister state relationship with a Mascara in Algeria, and the ambassador from Algeria will be here next Tuesday and Wednesday in El-Khoury for a special function. And unbeknown to most, which the media did not really project, when Cedar Rapids had its flood last year, or 2 years ago, Algeria was one of the few countries that immediately gave $250,000. And there was an article about this small in the Gazette. And most of that money went to El-Khoury, and part of it came into Cedar Rapids. So the heritage of Islam in Iowa is embedded within our Iowa history. The first mosque built in North America and the continuing mosque is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The first Islamic cemetery established in 1948 is in Cedar Rapids. The first international Islamic conference was held in 1954 in Cedar Rapids between United States and Canada with guests from Egypt. Personally, I was born and raised in Cedar Rapids. I was the first Muslim to go to the Peace Corps. I went in Senegal. I went to school here at the university. I was accepted to law school, but a good friend from Shenandoah, Iowa kept talking about Peace Corps, and then I went to Senegal to help develop the first international Olympic freestyle wrestling team. And as we all know, there's 3 R's in Iowa: reading, writing, and wrestling. So I'd wrestled all through school and went to nationals, and Peace Corps at that time was looking for a contingent of international coaches as Senegal was newly independent for track, swimming, wrestling, and basketball. As a side note to that, the first African from sub-Saharan Africa to get a medal in the Olympics was one of our wrestlers that medaled in the Moscow Olympics, the Olympics that we boycotted. But when you ask about MIDAMAR Corporation, when I was in Senegal, about 35 to 40% of the children died before the age of 5 because of malnutrition and protein deficiency. And then after visiting or staying 2.5 years in Senegal, another coach, Carl de Caspers from Pennsylvania, who I still stay in contact with. We decided there must be more in the world than the United States, so we took our Pan American tickets. That's when Pan Am was an existing airline. We cashed it in, and we started in Senegal and trekked across West Africa through Liberia, Guinea, Upper Volta, Togo, Dahomey, Ghana, Ivory Coast, to Nigeria. And at that time, Africa was a very civil, peaceful continent. And we had Peace Corps teachers throughout all of Africa. We got to Nigeria, and the decision was, do we go back home or do we keep going? We got one of the last flights into Brazzaville, not realizing that with the revolution with Patrice Lumumba, we got stuck in Brazzaville. And from there, we figured out, what do we do now? We caught a flight was supposed to go to Malawi, and it dropped us in South Africa. But it had a very regimented police state, as we well know, the history of South Africa. And unfortunately, on the political side, probably the only really embedded constructive policy that we had vis-a-vis Africa in the last 30-some years was the apartheid boycott and the apartheid policy on South Africa. Other than that, we've unfortunately have not had a really constructive development policy for Africa outside of Peace Corps and the policy against the apartheid. And this is one of the reasons that we have the lack of profile in Africa that we have, and it's one of the reasons we went on this mission last week with various departments trying to put protein into the hands of schools and hospitals. Then we started up the east coast of Africa. Across, we got to Cairo, and we decided to fly to Lebanon. We went and found my dad's village and stayed there. By the time we got there, we looked like a couple war wrecks after trekking across Africa. But one of the things that the Nigerians found very interesting last week when I was in Nigeria is that I traveled throughout more of Africa than we had African representatives from about 15 countries at this conference, that I traveled some 35 years ago before many of them were born throughout Africa. And they said, what was some of your concerns at that time? I said, the only concern we had was diarrhea. For some reason, we never even thought about malaria. Things like HIV and AIDS didn't exist. Robbery didn't exist. Kidnapping didn't exist. Africa was a very, very civil continent. Now, coming back to Islam and the perception or misperception of Islam in the United States and in our general media, does anyone, and I'm sure somebody might know, where are two of the oldest American universities that are overseas? The two oldest continuous American universities.
Lebanon. Yes.
And yes, Cairo, the American University of Beirut and the American University of Cairo. These are the two oldest continuing American educational institutions in overseas. You don't find one in Europe or in Japan or China. So the question, why did the academic community look to this particular region of Egypt and Lebanon decades ago to seek knowledge and have educational exchange? There was no clash of civilization. There was no barrier between the United States and these developing countries. So our misperception of Islam in this country has been distorted by the media and by September 11th. September 11th was a terrible tragedy, both in terms of life and as an act of terrorism and destruction, but it's also been a terroristic attack on the academia. It has identified a region. And the other unfortunate thing about discussing Islam and the world order today, it sort of focuses on this volcano from Afghanistan to Iraq and part of Saudi Arabia, forgetting that Islam goes from Suriname in South America to Seattle in Washington State, to Mauritania and Morocco, all the way to Malaysia, from Shanghai to Saudi Arabia to Singapore. But rarely do we ever talk about the Islam, the breadth of Islam from literally Shanghai all the way to Suriname. And we focus on this volcano that's erupting within Afghanistan, Iraq, and I should have brought a calendar, a Peace Corps calendar, because last year on the Peace Corps calendar, on the August page, there's a beautiful picture of this little Afghan man sitting there with a little drill that you drill by hand with a string. And what was he fixing? He was repairing a pottery cup. And it shows how fragile some of these societies are, that you have craftsmen that will repair pottery cups and plates and what have you, rather than just throw them and discard them. But the interesting thing about this picture, it was taken by Jamie Robbins, who is a Peace Corps volunteer, and she was in Afghanistan. And after she left the Peace Corps, for 2 years, she traveled throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan in 91 and 92 and 93. And she wrote a book, Islam at the Top of the World. Now, the question I asked Senator Grassley and Harkin, and when Congressman Leach was in and Loebsack won't listen, I mean, he's off on his own tangent, that's my political view, but when I showed them this picture, and I said, what does this picture tell you? They said, well, it tells me a lot of things, but what? I says, here's a young American girl, served in the Peace Corps. She hitchhiked and trekked and traveled alone for 2 years, was never molested, never raped, never injured in any way in the region today that we call the most notorious, dangerous region of the world. Now, what has changed in this 15-year period that we had literally hundreds of Peace Corps volunteers from Indonesia to Pakistan to Afghanistan to Morocco to Nigeria and Senegal and Philippines and South America. And now all of a sudden we have this image, they hate us. People, believe me, people around the world don't hate us. In some way our media has to get over this. Now, how does this affect us as Muslims in Iowa? We have been working on a camp, and many of you probably heard of MICA. And where did MICA come from? It came from Muslim Youth Camp of America, MYCA. It's just 10 miles from here. We started it before September 11th. It was a Girl Scout camp called Camp Daybreak for 20 years. And we came up with the idea that we needed a youth camp for youth, and just as YMCA is organized by Christians but open to all faiths, under the mandate of the Army Corps of Engineers, we designed and put together a petition to get this camp in the 20 acres that had been used for 20 years by the Girl Scouts. Everything went well for a year and a half, and then September 11th came. And believe me, it blew up like, you guys are terrorists. You're building this camp that trained terrorists in Al-Qaeda, and we just got the lease signed 2 years ago, year and a half ago. The Army Corps of Engineers said, this is the longest it has ever taken us to complete a lease for any type of camp, or because the Army Corps of Engineers sets land aside throughout the United States. The Army Corps of Engineers, many of you know, is responsible for all of the waterways in the United States, and there are waterways that are designated for different types of camps. Now, MICA is a camp open to all religions, all faiths, all boys and girls. But we've just gone through this terrible media image that if it's going to have anything to do with Islam, you must be going to be training terrorists or doing something out there. So finally, we're working on it, we're getting tent platforms, but it's open to all children between the age of 8 to 18. It's non-denominational. So that brings us to the question of how Islam faith, and when I was in Al-Khoury, I started to tell you about Al-Khoury. When I was there in November, one of the fellows says, well, you know, we keep hearing that Muslims have to kill a Christian or kill an infidel to go to heaven. And I says, well, I said, you hear that over and over. I said, but let me explain one thing. I said, my parents came to Iowa and our grandparents came here. And I said, hopefully they're not in hell. And he said, what do you mean? I said, because none of our parents have ever committed a crime or killed anybody. So if you really believe this stereotype, this misinformation, what happens to all the good Muslims that didn't slaughter anybody? And we can say as a Muslim community, and ask yourself within your own religious community or ethnic community, our families came in 1888. You cannot find one record of any Muslim ever being in a federal prison in Iowa or within from our community for rape, robbery, murder, child molesting, or family abuse. Now that's not an opinion, that's a fact. That in the last 100 years we have no community member from our religious or family community that has ever stepped a foot in a federal prison. Yes, traffic violations, everybody get those. So if Muslims are supposed to be as violent as we, hear the media and to be a threat, why in the last 100 years has no law been violated in this manner? So there's so many misperceptions. Now, most of our families came from the region of Lebanon and Syria. You keep me on time for time. I'm not watching the time. I don't have a watch. So
No, a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The origin of most of the immigrants to Iowa came from what was called Greater Syria. Prior to World War I, what is now Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel was all called Greater Syria. It was under the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And at that time, many of the immigrants that came, how many of you saw the movie Titanic? A few of you? Almost 20% of the immigrants on the Titanic came from Lebanon. And if you saw in the movie where they closed the gates and the people were trying to get upstairs, if you listen closely and you recognize it, they were saying their prayers in Arabic. But the immigrants that came, many of them settled on the East Coast. My father's family, they came and settled in northwest Iowa and worked primarily on German farms. The Germans hired these young men just as immigrant workers, many as you see as the Mexican and Hispanics today. Eventually, none of them were formally educated, but they all prospered well, and most of them went into some type of grocery business. A few of them went into farming. Then they moved to Urbana and Cedar Rapids. And in the 50s and 60s, you can probably say that 70% of the grocery stores in Cedar Rapids were people from either Greece, there was a very small Greek community, small Italian family community, and Lebanese family. A bit about MIDAMAR. MIDAMAR stands for Mid-America Agricultural Research. Went to Senegal, then I came back to the University of Iowa to do graduate work in international studies. I never looked back at law school, although I got accepted. And in '66, I got a Fulbright grant to go to South Vietnam to do an agricultural research study on the role of declining agriculture as related to increased military conflict, because we virtually destroyed the infrastructure of part of the Mekong Delta with Agent Orange, which is still a problem. In Chao Duc, Chao Phu, Can Tho region of South Vietnam, it has the highest contamination of dioxin anywhere in the world. And we have not recognized that. And children still born today, about 30% of the children in the Mekong region of Chao Duc, Chao Phu, Can Tho are born deformed. And we have not addressed that. Then after Vietnam, I went back here to the University of Iowa to study again in my graduate studies. Then I went to Saudi Arabia from 1967 to 70 to teach technical English, and always back to Iowa. And then I quit what I was doing to start MIDAMAR as a idea to take Iowa protein and agricultural development back to Africa and the Middle East. And so in the last 25 years, we've done that. I don't know if you have questions later, but the Islamic community is deeply rooted in Iowa, and with many professors, many students, and so we've always been grateful for Iowa, but it's been a challenge. We've had literally death threats. We've had our Islamic centers desecrated. We've had some of our students literally physically beaten because of this stereotype. And one of the last points, which Chris is talking about, being in Iran, many people cannot distinguish between Iranians and Arabs and what have you. And people say, well, you have Turks and you have Arabs and you have Iranians. What's the difference? I said, it's very easy. You think about Spain and Italy and Greece. They're all Mediterranean people. But Spaniards are not Italians, Italians are not Greeks, and Greeks are not Spanish. But they have similar cultures, but they each have their own distinguishing foods and cultures and songs. Likewise with Turkish, Iranians, and Arabs, they come from a commonality of religion and region, but they all have separate identities. So we are in a global community. As I said, the two of us would represent the world order if we're sitting in the UN. So I don't know if you have any questions later. Or
Yeah, perhaps you can stay to the end of the program and people can
I have one last
communicate
comment.
directly.
When you were talking earlier about the water shortage in the Middle East, there's no water shortage. There's a lack of priorities. Because 4 F-16 fighter planes that we give to Israel and sell to Saudi Arabia, 4 F-16 fighter planes will build a desalination plant that will produce 1 million gallons of water every day, 24 hours a day. So if you want to provide water, yes, because this is the thing we tell our senator, water is an issue because of the lack of priority. Now, if we would take these fighter planes away from Israel and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, because in all probability they're not going to have another major war in Saudi Arabia, you could start in Gaza, and every 25 miles build a desalination plant all the way up to South Turkey and have all the water, because Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Qatar, they have all of the water, clean water that they need, and it's from desalination. So when we talk about the political impact of water within Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, it's a lack of priority and a lack of where we're going to put our money and get it and drink from. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This is Bill Aossey. Thank you so much. We're moving to our next segment now, and I'm inviting our next guests to come up. We have Doug Jones, Shams Ghoneim, and George El-Khoury, who will be joining us here in just a moment. This is World Canvas, produced by International Programs at the University of Iowa. So happy to have you all with us this afternoon, or watching on television, listening on the radio. Next to me here is Shams Ghoneim, and she lives in Iowa City and is an American Muslim born and raised in Cairo, Egypt, an alumna of the University of Iowa, retired research staff member, and you lived here for 43 years. You have many involvements, volunteer activities, and religiously connected activities, and I'll ask you to talk a little bit about those in just a moment. Next to Shams is Professor Doug Jones from the Computer Science Department here at the University of Iowa, and wonderful to have you here, Mr. Jones. I know that you are a member of our faculty since 1980, and you're a member of the congregation Agudas Hakim here in Iowa City, and you're active in the Jewish, Muslim, and Jewish Christian dialogue groups there. And then Dr. El-Khoury, George El-Khoury, very good to have you here. You're a radiologist at the University of Iowa, and you grew up as a Christian in Lebanon and live here in Middle America, concerning yourself with interfaith issues, as is true with your friends on the panel. So I'd like to start first with you, Shams. Thank you for writing the commentary that appeared in the Press Citizen on Tuesday, kind of summarizing your thoughts about communicating on the most difficult issues, especially when they concern faith and culture.
You're welcome.
Yeah. How have you, why have you felt it was so important to spend so much of your life encouraging this kind of dialogue?
Well, just like Mr. Aossey was saying, it actually started by accident shortly before 9/11. And then definitely after 9/11, I've never really talked about religion. We were raised that this is inappropriate. It's personal. Mm-hmm. It's a personal journey between each one of us and the Almighty. And unless you're asked, and again, very few people asked, you know. Mm-hmm. So after 9/11, it really, and all the horrendous misconceptions and the horrific violence and the sense of real grief as a Muslim that someone would hijack actually the faith in such a horrific manner, doing everything in opposition of the teachings of the faith. We had to speak out, you know, even those of us who've never really felt comfortable doing so. So that's how it started, and that's how I feel it was important. Coming back from Egypt, it's Jews, Christians, and Muslims are sort of intertwined. You know, I come from a mixed faith family. Both my son, many uncles, cousins are married from the Christian faith. And had there been enough Jews in Egypt in the last, 30, 40 years, that would have been the same. So really the diversity, the religious diversity in the Middle East is just part of life, So there is no animosity, there is no contradictions. It's one faith, one message from the one God.
Well, let me turn to you, Professor Jones. And you are Jewish, as we mentioned earlier, and you also participate in this interfaith dialogue with members of the Christian community, members of the Muslim community, and perhaps others as well. And you live in a country that is, I think most would consider this a majority Christian country, for those who identify themselves as members of a religion. What's your perception as to the difficulty of living in such a culture?
Well, the United States is overwhelmingly Christian. Even atheists in the United States tend to speak about religion in a Christian idiom. And so you get terms like interfaith dialogue, because religion is characterized as faith. And that turns out to be very much following Paul in the New Testament. If you look at other religions, it's not always pure faith. Sometimes it's a question of law. What law do you follow, or what festivals do you keep? In the Jewish world, the debate between those who define Judaism as faith and those who define Judaism as action is at least 2,000 years old. And as a community, the Jewish community doesn't agree that religion equals faith, but rather part of religion equals faith. So you get atheists who rail against religions by saying that each religion claims that it's the only way to God, and that all other religions are false. And I'm not sure that's true of any religion other than Christianity. The Judaism and Islam both seem to permit a God who acknowledges the righteousness of people who aren't followers of their own religion. Although in times of distress, members of each religion have occasionally gotten very narrow in their views, and you get extremism emerging. But the traditions on both the Jewish and the Islamic side do allow this other thing. And so the sociologists have coined this term Christian privilege to refer to the privilege that you have as a member of the majority. You never have to explain why you're taking off work for Christmas, whereas a Jew definitely has to explain why they're taking off work for Yom Kippur, and a Muslim would definitely have to explain why they're taking off work for Eid al-Adha. Did I get it right?
Two feasts, Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr.
Yes, I confused them. But the need to explain yourself and the need to justify yourself when you're a member of a small minority goes way up. And it becomes constant about many issues. And this leads, I think, to the quite appropriate term Christian privilege, which is very comparable to the notion of white privilege that whites have in a society where blacks are a small minority. So in that regard, if you think about Jews and Muslims, we're in very similar situations as small minorities in a large country in the United States. And in that regard, there's a certain amount of equality in interreligious dialogue that's not there when you have Jewish-Christian dialogue. I remember one case where a Christian was saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if every church could have a Jewish-Christian dialogue group with the local Jewish community? And I was saying, wouldn't it be impossible? There are only 3% of us who are Jewish in this country, and if every church had a dialogue group, that would mean every Jew would be spending full time in dialogue. It can't work.
Well, perhaps I'll turn to you, George, and ask you a little bit about your background. I mentioned that you spent the first 30-some years of your life growing up in Lebanon, and you were a member of the Christian community in Lebanon. And then coming here to America, you are, you're living in a part of the world which has although we've heard about the rich history of Muslims in Iowa, you certainly were not in the majority when you came here, although you were part of the Christian faith. So in some senses, you may have had some kind of easy transition. Could you tell us a little bit about both experiences,
Sure.
your earlier life and then what it's like for you
Sure.
here?
Lebanon prides itself as being an amalgam of religions. They say at least that there are 17 religions represented in Lebanon. And the politics in Lebanon is built on religion. So by convention, for instance, the president of the republic is a Christian. And the prime minister is a Sunni Muslim. And the speaker of the house is a Shiite Muslim. And when I lived in Lebanon as a child and then a young man, I lived in a town called Sidon, which is a historical town. And in the center of town, which is probably thousands of years old, because it is a Phoenician town, which is also in the Bible mentioned as a Canaanite, which is the same term, I think. There's also a Presbyterian church in the center of town, and a synagogue in the center of town, and the vast majority of the population, however, was Muslim. The schools, the private schools, there were two strong private school, if you like, tracts. One was Jesuit, and the Jesuits are known for having good schools, and the other one was Presbyterian, and they started about 200 years ago during the Ottoman Empire. And I went to the Presbyterian school, and obviously it reflected the population. There were probably at 75% Muslims and 25% Christians. And every day, because it was a missionary school, we had to go to the chapel. And we sang hymns together, and I thought that was a sign of tolerance on the part of the Muslims and the few Jews that they went to chapel. These schools used to feed, especially the Presbyterian schools, used to feed the American University of Beirut with students, as you heard here. It's a very good school, and I myself, when I had my high school, I went to the American University of Beirut and became a medical doctor, and then specialized there for 2 years, then came here and finished my residency and went back to work there to find that there is a civil war that started. And then I came back to America. My family again reflects the country, which is an amalgam of religions. My mother is a Greek Orthodox, which is obviously a Christian sect. And my father is Melkite, which is basically Greek Orthodox, but for political reasons during the Middle Ages sided with the Pope. But the liturgy and the theology is the same. At any rate, when it was time to leave, I met a girl from the same area, but she turned out to be Presbyterian, which probably 0.5% of the population. It's a very small minority sect. So when I came to the US, well, there is no Melkite church here. There are in the big cities or Greek Orthodox church in my neighborhood. So I went to the Presbyterian church. And the Presbyterian church is fairly open here. It's not a monolithic group. They don't all feel, let's keep the Jews and the Muslims out. Us and them, that in a good group of the Presbyterians, this doesn't exist. And one of the committees in the church that I liked to serve in was an outreach committee. And then later on, I learned that Eastern Iowa in general has a synod for all the churches that has bigger committees, and one of them was concerned with peace. I said, this is where I want to serve, this is where I want to spend my free time. And I went to that committee, and it was really a very fulfilling committee for me. For instance, 5 years ago, they looked at what Mr. Aossey was talking about, how the Muslims were portrayed in the media.
Yeah.
And we said, well, we who lived among them don't think they are like that.
Yes.
And so we said, let's start talking to them and having an interfaith group. And the purpose of this group will be to increase understanding and promote respect. And I think we worked hard on that. We started as a very small group, maybe 6, 7 people. Now the group grew to about 25 on the mailing list. But because this is a very mobile community, in any one meeting, we probably are about 12 to 15 people. You may ask, I don't want to take other people's time, you may ask, what do we discuss?
Yeah.
Well, we discuss everything. We read scripture to each other, and we find it's very similar. For instance, the Old Testament is very common to all.
Yes.
Even the names of the prophets and
Yes.
the sayings and the stories are very similar. And if you look at the basics of religions, it was probably summarized best by Jesus, worship God and help your neighbor. And when one lawyer asked him, who is your neighbor? He told him who is his neighbor. It is everybody. Everybody is your neighbor. So Muslim, Jewish, doesn't matter. Sometimes we bring guests to the group who are not in any of these, monotheistic religions, and they feel welcomed, and we discuss things.
Well, then that leads me to both Shams and Doug. I know that you recently talked, the two of you went together to Indian Hills Community College, I think, and you talked about interfaith dialogue and how it works, what you perhaps personally get from it, and also what your hopes might be for interfaith dialogue. Could you share some of that with us?
Well, okay. I've been doing interfaith now for, 9 years almost. The Jewish-Muslim dialogue group is more recent, 2 years about. But then we have a wonderful group of about 12 ladies who are Christian-Muslim dialogue. We've been together for some 7, 8 years. I guess it's interesting about minority and majority. I mean, in Egypt, I was Muslim, so I was in the majority religion. Here, I'm in the minority religion, so it's kind of an interesting switch. I think what I get out of it is a lot of wonderful feeling of unity, and of course, also the ability to speak about some tough topics.
Yeah.
And for us, coming from the Middle East, it's always been, sadly, the conflicts within the Holy Lands, and it is holy to all three, Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So from the Jewish-Muslim dialogue, really, it was so wonderful. Rabbi Portman is, of course, the initiator as well of the dialogue, comparing Islamic law and Jewish law, which is fantastic. I haven't, read really the Talmud. So we find, just like Doug was saying, a lot of similarities between the laws. And of course, as far as Christianity is concerned, the Quran is really it brings all the three together, because Islam is not a new religion. It's sort of a reaffirmation of the teachings of all the prophets, and Muslims believe from Adam all the way to the Prophet Muhammad, who is believed to be the seals of the Prophet. What I get out of it is knowledge. What I hope we share is that we can, in a non-confrontational manner, talk about really passionate issues. For me, justice, issues of justice. If you speak about law from the theological perspective, how can any people believe in an issue which is basic to this justice issue and yet have lack of it in the most holiest of lands? So for me, that was a very difficult conversation to have done outside the interfaith, unless it is done with people with the same wavelength.
Sure.
So we have a different group members that some feel one way and some feel in the middle, and some are more liberal and some are not. So
Yeah.
So one of the things I've learned, my longest involvement with interfaith dialogue is with the Jewish-Christian dialogue. And one of the things I've learned there that I think continues with the Jewish-Muslim dialogue is that participation works best if you get people who are genuinely engaged with their own faith. If you have someone who comes and says, well, I don't really believe in this religion, but I think that's what they believe, that doesn't work very well. You need people who have a commitment to their own faith first. The second thing is that I think the ultimate purpose of the dialogue isn't to do missionary work. If you come into it thinking you're going to do interfaith dialogue and convert someone, it doesn't work. You have to be there to learn more about your own faith by reflecting on the other faith, and to learn more about the other faith by comparing it with your own. When that happens, I think it works very well. You can see, when you see your own scriptures reflected through the eyes of people who have a different faith, and we see that a lot between Islam and Judaism, because they share so many stories that are told differently. I think it can be very, very uplifting. And furthermore, there's this tremendous opportunity to understand a different culture that has been wrestling with the same question all along. And the question we wrestle with is the question of how do you do God's will and how do you do justice in the world? Both the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim tradition are, in a sense, compared to Christianity, legalistic. We have codes of law that are at the core of much of what we do in these religions, and they're different, and yet they address so many of the same issues, and they come to so many of the same conclusions. And I think it's very instructive to look at this.
Mm-hmm. And just one remark too. The differences, from my perspective, about the position of Islam in the U.S., actually in the Western Hemisphere as well, but specifically in the U.S., and Judaism, is there is no the affinity, so to speak. There's so much commonalities, even though I know Doug is not going to agree with this. Christian Americans are very familiar with Judaism. I mean, you learn the Old Testament and the New Testament, at least. But Islam isn't in the picture. That's why I think it was so easy to, after such a horrific jolt, if you like, in 9/11, to buy into all the garbage, I'm sorry to say, and from high-profile religious leaders. These are Christian, high-profile religious leaders that went out there, and all of a sudden they know everything about Islam and Muslims, and everything about the Quran. And that, to me, that pushed someone like myself and others to say, wait a minute, you really don't know what you're talking about. So I felt, as a Muslim in interfaith, you're doing a bunch of things. One of them is really to correct the misconceptions and to focus on the commonalities. And differences are man-made and human interpretation. And for Islam to be part of that mosaic, which we are in this wonderful land, we need to talk about it. And so violent acts do not hijack any of us.
I wish we had far longer to talk. This has been a very, very interesting conversation for me. And George El-Khoury, thank you so much for coming to talk with us. Doug Jones, thank you. And Shams Ghoneim, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. So this is WorldCanvass. I'm Joan Kjaer, and we're being taped right now for broadcast on University of Iowa Television statewide, and also local broadcast on KRUI-FM. And we'll have broadcast details posted on the International Program's website, accents.international.uiowa.edu. And just now, Downing Thomas, the Associate Provost here at the University of Iowa and also Dean of International Programs, is just next to me. Thank you, Downing. And Scott King, who's the head of one of the International Programs units, a very important one, the Office for International Students and Scholars. Please welcome these two guests. Many of you may know that the University of Iowa is always engaged in recruitment of students from the United States, and also international recruitment. And as the Dean of International Programs, Downing is very often traveling or engaged in these kinds of efforts. And I thought I would turn to you to tell us something about some of the work the University of Iowa is doing in the Middle East to encourage faculty exchanges and scholarship and whatnot.
Good. Thanks, Joan. I'd start more generally, I think, talking about exchanges, global exchanges, international exchanges. The president of the University of Arizona wrote last week a letter to the community talking about the tremendous contributions to scholarships, teaching, and outreach that foreign nationals make on the campus of the University of Arizona, and that he was going to do everything in his power to make sure that those folks who are giving such contributions to the mission of his institution were safe while abiding by the new Arizona law. We're here in the Heartland, of course, but we at the University of Iowa also believe that international exchanges are tremendously, perhaps for that reason, all the more important for our student, staff, and faculty. And so we are looking to increase the diversity on campus. Generally, when we think of diversity, people tend to think of domestic minorities, but we feel that it's equally important to stress the global diversity of this campus. Just 3 years ago, in the fall of 2007, we had 60 new first-year undergraduate international students. In the fall 2010, this coming fall, we expect to see around 320 new first-year undergraduates. And so that population, that's just one slice of the population, is growing tremendously. And to address your specific question, in terms of recruiting students, we want to make sure that the international population itself is diversified. So we are very pleased to see so many students from China, from South Korea, from India. We want to make sure that other areas of the planet are represented so that Iowa students, both so that those students have the opportunity to develop an education here at the University of Iowa and go back to their countries as ambassadors, alums, and friends. But we also want to make sure that University of Iowa students from everywhere, from Iowa, have a chance to be exposed to and interact with students from all over the world. So we are looking to other parts of the globe, to places like Malaysia, to Vietnam, which is growing tremendously economically at the moment, to Africa, to South America, and yes, to the Middle East, where there are a number of opportunities to expand our population with students who are sponsored by governments. And Scott will talk a little bit about that in a minute, and other students who have the ability to come here. We offer some scholarships to international students, and we hope to see many different kinds of international students on our campus in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was Downing Thomas. Scott, Downing just mentioned some of the recruitment initiatives that you have engaged in, and we want to talk specifically about an Iraqi initiative, which is very exciting.
A very exciting one where I think the university is really taking a leadership role nationally on this. In November of 2008, the Iraqi government started a process to develop a scholarship program that eventually will send about 50,000 students to the United States to study. They invited around 150 schools to come to a symposium that was being held in Baghdad in January of 2009, and we were one of only 22 institutions that accepted the invitation to go, and very proud to say that we were the only Big Ten institution that was represented there. I traveled to Baghdad, which was an experience that could take up 2 hours in itself to talk about. But there was a very high-level meeting that involved government leaders, the U.S. ambassador was present, heads of universities, where they announced an initiative to send 10,000 students per year for 5 years, fully funded by the Iraqi government to English-speaking countries, primarily the United States and Great Britain, hopefully expanding into Canada and Australia later on. We were honored guests there. I said 22 U.S. schools were present. The UK was present through the British Council. They did not send schools, but we heard of a plan that was very ambitious. It was taken out of the existing scholarship program to remove the politics from it. And from the beginning, they said the scholarships should be allocated by province, so it would cut across ethnic, religious, all these divisions within the country. They didn't put a goal on it, but said also that there would be a wide representation of women in the process. We had a school fair there that was very exciting. About 300 Iraqi students came and talked to us, and what I found was great was that we had students in law, journalism, education, things that would rebuild society and not just the physical infrastructure. This was followed with another meeting in Sulaymaniyah. As part of the goal of diversity, we did go into the Kurdish region with a similar presentation, which had the additional challenge of having to be done in 3 languages. In Baghdad, it was only English and Arabic. When we got to Sulaymaniyah, we had to add Kurdish in. And it's taken about a year for the program to get organized, a little longer than they expected, and we've seen some bumps along the road, but very ambitious project, hampered by communication issues within Iraq. Right now, we're expecting 8 students out of an initial, I believe about 200 they're placing for the first year to come here in the fall. But a personal thing that was very exciting is that I happened to be there on the day of the presidential inauguration, so we all got to see the President Obama inaugurated while standing at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. And I told people when I went to the caucus here in January of 2008, never would have imagined that was going to be the case.
No, I can imagine. Well, before we let you two go, I thought I would also ask both of you, or Downing, about this term global competence that one hears, at least in academic circles these days. What is intended by the term global competence?
I think no one really knows, is the truth of the matter. It's a much spoken about phrase. I think what it intends to refer to is the kinds of exposure and knowledge, skill sets that it takes to cross borders, to work with and learn from and be open to people from other places with other beliefs, other practices. So it really is quite a grab bag, and there are many ways to global competence, again, whatever that really truly is. Some of it involves intensive language study, long language study, but also learning about the different parts of the world. Study abroad is a key factor in it. But we do many things here right on campus to enhance that, even if students stay in Iowa City for their entire education through curricular projects and interactions of other kinds.
Do you have anything to add to that, Scott?
I don't know how much more I can add from my dean on that, but I think the only thing I would add is being comfortable within your own skin so that you can get out there and interact with people from different backgrounds.
Thanks, you guys, for coming over to talk a little about all of our international ambitions here at the University of Iowa and the success that we've already seen, especially growing in these last few years. So Downing Thomas and Scott King, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
We have a couple of very interesting segments coming up. Next, 2 playwrights will tell us about how their experiences in the Middle East really changed their art and changed their lives. And following that, we'll have a piano performance by just a wonderful pianist, Hayk Arsenyan, who is from Armenia and who's just come in from Chicago, where he was giving Dame Myra Hess concert, I think. So here on stage with me now are Lisa Schlesinger and Joshua Casteel. And thank you guys so much for being with us tonight. Lisa, I'm going to read a little bit about you, also about Joshua. You are a playwright and a teacher, used to teach here at the Playwrights Workshop at the University of Iowa, and now Lisa teaches at Columbia College in Chicago. Some of her plays are Wall Martyrs, Celestial Bodies, 21 Positions. Some of the groups from which she's received commissions are the Guthrie Theater, the BBC, and the Portland Stage Company. Among the many awards and fellowships she's received are the BBC International Playwriting Award and the TCG NEA Playwrights Residency Award. Her essay, Postcards from Gaza and Other Unspeakable Geographies, is included in Out of Silence, Censorship and Self-Censorship in Theater and Performance. And Joshua Casteel, some of you have met around campus here in the last couple of years. He's a playwright who attended and taught at the UI Playwrights Workshop. He has received his MFA here and is soon heading to Chicago for more studies. He grew up in Cedar Rapids, went to West Point, was a military interrogator at Abu Ghraib, and left the military as a conscientious objector. He's now, as I mentioned, headed off to the University of Chicago. His works include the play Returns, which was produced at the University of Iowa and was one of 9 winners at the National MFA Playwrights Festival that same year. So thank you very much for being here. Lisa, I would like to ask you first about your visits to the Middle East as a writer of conscience.
I first went to the occupied Palestinian territories in 2003, right after the war started. In Iraq. I went on a trip with 5 other playwrights. The intention of the trip was to go and see what was happening in theater in the occupied territories. Was there theater? Could theater survive under occupation? And what were people talking about in theater, in the occupation? So I went with Naomi Wallace, Tony Kushner, Betty Shemia, Kjaer Corthron and Robert O'Hara. We were like the Rainbow Club. And Tony Kushner and I were the 2 Jewish members of the Rainbow Club. Betty Shemia was Palestinian. And so when we landed in the Ben Gurion airport, instead of going into West Jerusalem, which is the Jewish part of Jerusalem, we went to East Jerusalem. And we stayed there. So my introduction into Israel and Palestine was in the Palestinian territories. So from there we went to Ramallah, Hebron. We visited one theater in Jaffa in Israel proper. But primarily we stayed in the territories, and we also went to Gaza. Now you can't go to Gaza, but at that time you could. Yeah. And I think I'll just say quickly, one of the most interesting things I found about the theaters was that the Palestinian theater artists were very involved with issues of Palestinian culture. They weren't doing theater about being in an occupied territory or blaming anyone or being under occupation. They were doing a lot of social theater about issues inside of their own communities, and I was really impressed with that. I was also impressed with the artistry of the theater, and I don't know how much we'll talk about today, but just one of the things that came out of that was a partnership with Iman Aoun from Ashtar Theater in Ramallah, and since that time we've done 3 collaborations together. Going over there, I brought Iman back here, and she worked with university students, and then I went back to Ramallah this last fall and worked with her with the Bread and Puppet Theater Company of Glover, Vermont. And we're now working on a piece called The Gaza Monologues, which she's connected, her Ashtar Theater is connected with the theater in Gaza, and they're working with youth to collect their experiences from Gaza, and then we'll be translating them into English.
Yeah, your comment about how the plays that you, the playwriting that you saw going on, really focusing on community issues and things that were not about the big picture of the Palestinians in the world or Palestine against Israel or whatever. That is very interesting. You didn't really expect to find that.
No, I didn't. I think I expected everything in Israel and Palestine to be focused on the conflict. Yeah. And also, I did expect that it was a religious conflict, which I did not find at all. I found that it's a secular conflict over resources.
Well, Joshua, let's turn to you for a second. You're also a playwright and writer, and we told just the briefest little bit about your biography here and the way you went to the Middle East, to Iraq, in specific terms. How did the experience you had there affect the artist you are now?
Well, I guess one thing I always have to comment on is I'm a very illustrious West Point dropout, and having been in various state areas of the military, whether it was West Point, enlisted life, combat training, and coming from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, I brought a host of both military and cultural experiences with me into Iraq, and I would say the most informative of those was my religious upbringing. I grew up in a very evangelical, nationalistic household, and I entered the military with a great deal of ambition and a great deal of irrational pride in my past, in my family past, in my national past, and I only say irrational just because it was the kind of enthusiasm that you have, or that I have at least, about the White Sox or the Chicago Bears, having a whole lot of fun with it, and that dissolved very, very quickly. I mean, I think that if you read any short story by Tim O'Brien or see any film about any war whatsoever, the first thing that goes out the window is talk about freedom, democracy, America, whatever. That combat is very much about bodies in space and people being next to each other and being able to see each other, to smell each other. It's very physical. And as an interrogator, which is a job in which your primary weapon is language, I had a very, very concrete perspective of warfare. It was never abstract. I was across a table from people having conversation. I knew the names and ages of the children of the men that I interrogated. I knew how long it had been since they'd seen their wives. And I spoke with them on a daily basis. I was in Iraq 6 months. I wasn't in for very long, but I had over 130 combat interrogations. And I had a turning point about 5 months, 4 or 5 months into my time in Iraq, and I'd probably had about 100 interrogations. And I, for the first time, had an interrogation with a self-proclaimed jihadi. And up until then, it had just been local laborers, imams, young fathers, schoolboys. It was not your cast of anti-heroes that you expect, perhaps watching the beheading of Nicholas Berg before heading over, which was the direct situation that I went into. And after having had 100 interrogations with average Ahmeds, we called them, I finally had one interrogation with a person who said, I'm here for jihad. My jihad is violent. He came from Saudi Arabia, and so he started to fit some of our profile of the bad guys that we were looking for. And he'd been in Iraq for not even 2 weeks yet before he was arrested by coalition forces. His cousin had been killed in Iraq, and he was recruited in a mosque in Saudi Arabia to fill the shoes of his cousin. And over the course of about the first 20 minutes to half hour of the interrogation, he tells me his understanding of jihad, and it was basically no more complex than non-Muslim army invades Muslim country, duty of Muslim, expel non-Muslim army. And coming from a Christian background, that was a slightly more, dialed down understanding of warfare than I'd heard about just war. And we talked a lot about religion, about ethics. After getting all of the regular military information, where he'd come from, access points, the groups that he was going to be affiliated with, and he told me that I was a very curious person because of the fact that I was a Christian, but I didn't do as the one I called Christ. I didn't turn the other cheek. I didn't pray for those who persecute me. And I said, well, this is an interesting moment. I'm getting schooled on the Sermon on the Mount by a self-proclaimed jihadi. And it became very apparent, though, that the more that we talked about these big ideas, the more that the only thing that separated the two of us was a mirror. And he was a kid who came because he thought it was his duty to fight on behalf of people and family. I was there for basically the exact same reason. And we talked about that as well. I said, wouldn't it be interesting if we had met 10 years down the road when I'm not a soldier and you're not in jail and you're not a prisoner? We could probably sit down and have tea. And I had been agonizing about my role as an interrogator, especially after seeing the kinds of detention practices that we upheld. We would go into villages and we would be looking for 4 people, but we'd come back with 84 people. We would just cast this huge net throughout villages in order to get a very few number of people. And we referred to the prison that I was at. I was at Abu Ghraib prison in the immediate wake of the prisoner abuse scandal. And we referred to Abu Ghraib as the largest terrorist training camp on earth, because you would bring in a ton of people who had no, what we would expect to be the radicalization. But then the things that happen to them while they're in prison start to mirror the things that they're being told by a very small number of people who are radical. And at that point, you can't do anything, because reality is dictating to them what they should believe. They are being persecuted. Their Qurans are being stepped on. They are being kept from their wives and children. And after that interrogation, after having gone through the first 4 or 5 months that I had at Abu Ghraib, I left the interrogation room, and I went to my superior, and I said, I can't go back in that room. If I do, I'm just going to see a 24-year-old boy, who's looking for answers. That's basically, I'm a 24-year-old boy who's looking for answers. And I'm going to want to talk to him man to man. I'm not going to want to talk to him as an interrogator. And shortly thereafter, I applied for conscientious objector status and was one of a very lucky few to be granted the status. And I left the military in May of 2005.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you came here then to study some more and to write.
Mm-hmm.
When you were in Iraq, were you at that time thinking of plays you wanted to put together? I mean, were you consciously thinking about how you might record some of your thoughts? Or
I was writing a lot of letters home, and I ended up inadvertently writing the first book that I had published while I was there. It wasn't the intention at all. I was writing really confessional, cantankerous emails to my parents and to my friends saying, I have no idea what's going on. Why on earth am I allowing myself to continue willingly participate in what's happening in Iraq? Because the blame cannot go to generals and politicians. I'm here on purpose. And if I want to be able to have any sort of ability to not just speak on it, but actually live a life in concert with those thoughts, I have to do something about it. I have to leave, and I have to live a different life.
Mm-hmm. And coming back to you, Lisa, how would you say that these 3 or more trips that you've taken to the West Bank and to see some things that most of us don't have an opportunity to see firsthand, how did it amplify your understanding of that part of the world?
Well, to begin with, I probably have to say that as I'm one of the only Jewish people I know that went to the Palestinian territories, not to Israel.
Yeah.
I did go into Israel later, and it looked very different to me than I think it would look to a person just going to Israel. Sometimes I've even imagined, what would it be if I'd gone to Israel and gone to the beach and seen all those crazy clothes in West Jerusalem and all that fashion. That's the fashion of a powerful country, because it's a very different aesthetic. I wonder sometimes about that, but I'm very glad I didn't. I'm very glad I went into the Palestinian territories. It taught me a lot. What has it done for me is it's opened up conversations across Israeli, Jewish, Palestinian, Christian, Arab, Muslim communities, everywhere I've been since. As I said, as soon as I went over, the first thing I did was bring Iman back, and we worked with theater students here, and some of them were Jewish, and they'd never met a Palestinian person before, and that is an enlivening and enlightening experience. And conversations start, friendships are made, and if Iman was here, you would see we're like sisters. So you have, an Eastern European Jewish woman who's really sisters with, she's Christian Palestinian woman. Yeah. And we have the same sense of humor, we have a similar artistic aesthetic, we have desire to open these conversations. So it's opened a lot of conversations with a lot of people, and I guess one of the things that crosses my mind is to try to open conversations, not preaching to the choir, not going where, it's a left-wing audience and we'll talk about occupation, but who is scared to talk to someone who's very different? Who is the other to each one of us, and how can we have a conversation with that person? And I think in playwriting we have an opportunity to bring all of these voices on stage. So we embody very different voices. They can be in conflict, but they can coexist, bodies in space. They can all be up there telling their stories, and the audience can interact that way with them. We don't have to give them a judgment. We can let people tell their stories. And in this case, the Gaza project, I feel the media was so stilted and one-dimensional on Gaza last year, and now we have an opportunity to hear what it was like for young people. One of my dreams actually is we work with one refugee camp in Bethlehem, the Ida camp, and one of my dreams is to set up video conversation with kids from the Ida camp, and my husband works in the Johnson School of the Arts in Cedar Rapids. I just think they would have a lot to say to each other, and similar culture, and there's some interesting musicality that's crossing the globe right now in terms of spoken word and rhythmic music, and I think people have a lot in common when they can speak to each other and hear each other. And part of what the media has done is shut us up and close that conversation, and act like we're saying something we're not. And I think that's very, very true, especially for Jewish people and Muslim people, because there's a huge community of people, and I think that sometimes we can use religion as a screen to divert us from the real issues. So I would like to bring it back to the real conversation between people.
Wonderful. Any closing thoughts from you, Joshua?
Well, I mean, I would say that Lisa's last comment of wanting to bring things back to the conversations between people was exactly what I encountered as an interrogator, of having dialogue with men every single day. And that's what was the most powerful aspect to crash through a lot of the ideologies that I had been raised in, was being able to not engage with ideologies, not talk about the movements of brigades and nations and interests, but to talk to a man named Muhammad, and to talk to a man named Ahmed, and to deal with them personally. And I think it's a challenge to be able to bring that kind of vividness of personal relationship into artistic works, but I think that theater provides a certain efficiency, because you actually get to see a real person on a real stage, and that's exciting.
Well, wonderful to have you both here. Lisa Schlesinger and Joshua Casteel, please say thank you to them. And so now we will go to the final segment in our program, and I'm inviting Hayk Arsenyan to this stage. Hello, Hayk. Good to have you here again. This is Hayk Arsenyan, an Armenian pianist. Thank you.
Hello.
Who recently graduated with his doctorate here from the University of Iowa. He teaches now at NYU at the Tisch School of Performing Arts, and he's just given a concert in Chicago, and I guess you're going to be doing more concertizing in the next few weeks?
No, actually, until August I don't have anything planned, so it's time for vacation. Sorry, but I'm sure there will be some things that will come up.
Well, as we were putting together this program, I wanted to see what music we might be able to arrange to have performed live here, and we had two unfortunate things happen. Originally, an oud player, sort of like a lute, was arranging to be with us, but a family emergency took him out of town, and then a gentleman from I think from Syria, was going to play a kanun and called me last Friday to say, I'm so sorry, but my kanun is broken. So luckily, Hayk is here with us.
I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, he's going to play music of a very famous, although perhaps not well known to us here in the States, a famous Armenian composer, Komitas. Tell us about this composer.
Well, he was born in 1869 in Ottoman Empire, and after witnessing the events of 1915, he lost his mind and was sent to Paris and living 20 years in the psychiatric clinic. He eventually died in Paris. Wonderful composer. He's considered as one of the founders of the Armenian classical music. He did something very similar to what Bartók did. Traveled extensively throughout the country, little villages, and collected and recorded more than 3,000 folk songs and dances. Yeah, these piano dances, I will play 3 of them. It's in a cycle of 7 dances. They are in very minimalistic form, and as he writes on the scores, he indicates that they are to imitate instruments like Armenian little recorder in combination with little drums. Just very simple, very folk sort of style.
Yeah. Good. So you're going to play 3 and then come back up and talk
about
this again.
Sounds very good.
Okay, great. So this is Hayk Arsenyan. Yeah.
And they are called Urangi, Yerangi, and Shushiki. So.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So music of Komitas, and there's a second name, or which is the
Solomon Solomonian. So he got the name Komitas after a 7th century Armenian Catholicos, who was actually also a hymn writer. So it's a tradition that when you graduate from the seminary, you are given another name.
Yeah,
so he was given the name Komitas.
So why don't we know this music better here in the States, do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, first of all, Armenia is such a little country, so I'm already in the terms with, the fact when I say I'm from Armenia, they're like, cool. Where's that?
Yeah. Yeah. So, generally, we're talking about this obviously hard to define and immense area we're roughly calling the Middle East, and Armenia would be close to Georgia and.
Right. It's a very interesting thing with Armenia that geographically, of course, we are Middle East, but culturally, we belong to Middle East as well as to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So we kind of fit in all the three, cultural.
Yeah, and you have done or will soon be doing some touring in the Middle East.
Yeah, I was very fortunate actually to have a concert tour in past January. I was in Syria and Lebanon. For almost 2 weeks. We, with my piano quartet from New York, we went to Aleppo, to Damascus, and Beirut. We also visited Baalbek and Byblos, gorgeous countries, and I'm just really very, very happy that I had that opportunity. We gave recitals there and as well gave master classes at the Dar al-Assad Center, which is a very similar musical institution to the Juilliard, exactly the same way, constructed with the opera house, the big concert hall, and the conservatory.
Yeah.
And very good students, very impressive. So very lucky. And there in Damascus, actually, I met an artist who is also New York-based and was also on tour in Damascus. He works with Yo-Yo Ma and Chick Corea and Brooklyn Riders, another string quartet, which is great. I just found them very recently. And what he does is he draws while the musicians are playing. He draws and it's connected through the software. It's on a screen, so audience is seeing it. And after we met, we talked and stuff. And when we came back to New York, he contacted me. He's like, "Hey, listen, I got a tour scheduled back to Middle East and East Coast and West Coast of America. Do you think you would like to collaborate?"
Yeah.
Like, absolutely. So I'm very much looking forward to this collaboration with him. It will be on Komitas. So I'll be playing Komitas, the 7 dances, and also some arrangements of his songs. And he will be drawing some gorgeous pictures. Oh, the really cool part of his art is that all those pictures that you are seeing while he's drawing, at some point he presses pushes the pedal or something. I don't know, I'm not very scientific person in general, but those pictures on the screen, they start dancing to the music. It's incredible. It's a really, really cool thing.
Wow.
Absolutely incredible. So I'm really looking forward to this collaboration.
Terrific.
And going back to Middle East, I mean,
Yeah.
so lucky.
Yeah.
I love that place. The food, oh my God. And people, so beautiful and so friendly.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I don't know if when you were touring the Middle East you performed any of the work by Soler that you. This guy is a real scholar when it comes to the music of a Spanish composer from 300 years ago, Padre Antonio Soler, and in another program I did in prior time, he performed amazingly.
Thank you very much.
Work by Soler, and so when you go on a tour, say through the Middle East, will you play any of those works or?
I do. I played in Spain last summer. I played Soler sonatas, among the rest of the repertoire. But this tour was with my piano quartet, so there was no Soler there. But we played, Mozart in Lebanon, and Brahms quartet, both in G minor, and we played some Piazzolla tangos. We arranged the saber dance of Kjaer for a quartet, as an encore.
Fantastic.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a beautiful experience, And that experience started right away when we flew to Cairo. So we already understood, okay, welcome. We are in the, different to the Western, eyes world.
Yeah.
So, beautiful.
And as a musician, how can you help us quickly understand why, when we hear certain songs or certain pieces, somebody who's used to Western classical music might say, oh, it sounds like that's from someplace else, or that could be from the Middle East. What is it tonally that's happening there?
Well, that's the modes, of course, the modal, construction of the melodies, of the harmonies. So we always associate, some kind of music. Oh, this sounds kind of Spanish to me. We even picture it already, right, with the dance, or even some rhythms. We hear it, and this sounds kind of like belly dancing. That could be, so it's all musically. We have it very much connected to the visual part of that perception. That's why actually that collaboration with Kjaer, with the artist. I feel that it's a really neat thing to hear and see music, sort of. It's almost like the dance field, of course.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up to the end of our program now, and I wonder, would you be so kind, as I say thank you to everybody, to go back to the piano and play one of those dances one more time?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, you go get ready there. I'll say thank you to everyone, and then we'll turn our attention to you again. Thank you. Hayk Arsenyan. So we are coming to the end of our program, and this is WorldCanvass, produced by International Programs at the University of Iowa. I would like to thank our guests this evening, of course, as well as our partners, the U of I, Pendercrest Museums, UITV, KRUI, and Informational Technology Services. Thanks also to our colleagues at International Programs, especially Amy Green, Jody Klein, Emily Lewis, David Rogers, and Chris Clough. We will be taking a summer hiatus. The next program will be September 10th in this room. I hope you can be with us. The evening's discussion topic is Documenting Humanity, a Sense of Place. So enjoy your summer, but please save the date, September 10th in this space. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and now back to Hayk.
Thank you so much.